You didn't choose who you became, not at first. You adapted. You adjusted. You noticed what worked and what didn't, what brought closeness, what created distance, what caused tension, what earned relief. And slowly, without any formal decision, a version of you took shape, a version that knew how to survive the environment it was born into. That version was intelligent, responsive, protective. It learned how to read rooms, how to anticipate reactions, how to minimize risk. It learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to disappear emotionally, when to perform. And for a long time, that version worked. It kept things together. It prevented chaos. It allowed you to function. So, you kept it. You kept being that person. Even as the environment changed, even as the threats faded, even as the original reasons stopped being relevant. Because identity doesn't update automatically. It preserves what once kept you safe. And preservation has a cost. There is a strange loyalty people have to their learned self, not because they love it, but because it's familiar. It knows how to navigate discomfort. It knows how to manage other people. It knows how to get through the day. It has rules. Rules about what you're allowed to want, what you're allowed to feel, what you're allowed to ask for. And those rules were not arbitrary. They were shaped by consequences. At some point, you learned that being too much created problems, that being too honest disrupted stability, that being too visible attracted scrutiny, that being too independent threatened attachment. So, you calibrated. You became readable in the right ways, muted in the dangerous ones, useful, predictable. That wasn't weakness, it was intelligence under pressure. But intelligence that adapts to survive doesn't ask whether the adaptation should remain forever. It just keeps running. And over time, what was once protection becomes a prison, one you defend without realizing it, because it's still keeping you from something, but now it's keeping you from yourself. What did you have to give up in order to become acceptable? The person you learn to be is very good at certain things: managing, containing, explaining, enduring. They know how to make sense of pain, how to rationalize disappointment, how to translate longing into responsibility. They are reliable. But reliability can hide loss, because that version of you did not develop to express your full range. It developed to limit it, to keep things from escalating, to keep emotions within tolerable bounds, to avoid conflict that once felt dangerous. And the cost of that limitation isn't paid all at once. It's paid slowly, in muted desire, in chronic hesitation, in the feeling that something is missing but unnamed. You may feel it when you're alone, a subtle flatness, a low-grade dissatisfaction, a sense that your life is technically functional but emotionally distant. Not tragic, just reduced. The learned self doesn't collapse your life, it narrows it, and narrowing feels safe, until it doesn't. At what point did safety begin to feel like suffocation? The learned self is efficient. It knows how to anticipate expectations. It often knows what others need before they ask. It knows how to prevent disappointment. But that skill has a shadow. When you are always anticipating, you stop discovering.
When you are always managing, you stop inhabiting. Your inner life becomes organized around response instead of presence. You live slightly ahead of yourself, monitoring, adjusting, correcting. This creates a quiet distance between what you feel and what you allow yourself to register. You may still feel emotions, but they arrive filtered, softened, explained, handled quickly. Because raw emotion was not rewarded. Raw emotion created instability, or distance, or punishment, or confusion. So you learned to metabolize it privately, or not at all. And now, years later, you may notice something unsettling. You are competent. you're capable, you're composed, and yet something inside you feels untouched, unlived, as if your life has been occurring slightly beside you. How much of your experience have you been translating instead of feeling? The learned self often prides itself on being realistic. It knows not to expect too much. It knows the limits. It knows how things usually go. That realism protects you from disappointment, but it also caps possibility. Because possibility requires a willingness to be wrong, to misjudge, to reach without certainty. And the learned self avoids that, not because it lacks courage, because it learned early that misjudging had consequences, that wanting too much could lead to loss, that trusting the wrong person could lead to pain, that stepping outside the role could destabilize the system. So it stays within bounds. It calls that maturity. And in many ways, it is. But maturity without flexibility becomes rigidity. And rigidity creates a life that looks stable from the outside, while quietly eroding vitality from the inside. The cost isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. It shows up as chronic restraint, as deferred joy, as a sense that your life is being lived on behalf of something else. What have you been calling being realistic that might actually be resignation? There is grief here, but it's not obvious grief. It doesn't arrive as tears. It arrives as nostalgia for something you never fully lived, a faint sense of regret without a clear object, a feeling that your life could have expanded in directions you never allowed, not because you didn't want to, because you didn't feel permitted. The learned self is deeply tied to permission. What you're allowed to feel, what you're allowed to pursue, what you're allowed to risk. And permission was once external, given or withheld by parents, by peers, by authority, by circumstance. But over time, the permission system internalized. You became your own gatekeeper. You began stopping yourself automatically, before desire could even fully form, before impulse could gather momentum. And now, the restriction feels like you, not like a rule, not like a limitation, just like your personality, which makes it harder to question, because questioning it feels like questioning your identity. If the learned self stepped aside, who would you be without its rules? The learned self also carries a moral tone. They are often good, responsible, considerate, measured. They don't rock the boat. They don't make unreasonable demands. They don't inconvenience others unnecessarily. They know how to be liked. But likability can become a constraint. When being good means being small. When being considerate means being silent. When being responsible means never prioritizing yourself. The learned self may feel proud of these traits, and they are not fake. They are real adaptations. But every adaptation solves one problem by creating another. Being good may have kept you connected. It may have kept you safe. But it may have also taught you that your needs are negotiable, that your limits are flexible, that your discomfort is less important than harmony. Over time, that lesson becomes embodied. You stop noticing when you were crossing yourself. You stop recognizing when you were betraying something internal, because the cost of conflict was learned early, and avoiding it became automatic. At what point did being good start costing you honesty? The learned self is not malicious. It is protective. It remembers. It remembers what happened last time you spoke up, last time you asked for more, last time you showed uncertainty, last time you expressed anger, last time you disappointed someone. Memory shapes identity. Not abstract memory, emotional memory, the kind stored in the nervous system. The learned self reacts before thought, before reflection, before conscious choice. It tightens, it hesitates, it redirects, and because it's fast, it feels like instinct, like truth, like just how you are. But instinct formed under constraint doesn't necessarily point towards freedom. It points towards survival. And survival has different priorities. Survival wants predictability. It wants stability. It wants known outcomes. Freedom introduces unknowns, and unknowns were once dangerous. So the learned self remains vigilant, even when the environment is different, even when the cost of vigilance exceeds the cost of risk. How often are you responding to a past environment that no longer exists? There is a moment that can be unsettling, a moment when you realize that the life you're living is not the life you chose. It's the life that emerged from adaptation, from compromise.
From staying within lines that were drawn before you understood you had a choice. This realization doesn't automatically lead to change. Often, it leads to confusion, because the learned self is still functioning, it's still doing its job, and stepping away from it feels like abandoning the only structure you know, the structure that made things workable, the structure that kept you intact. So there's hesitation, not about whether something is missing, but about whether you can afford to stop being the person you learned to be, because that person has history, relationships, roles, expectations. People know you as them, and if you change, even subtly, something shifts. Others may notice, others may react, others may resist, not because they're against you, because your learned self was part of a system, and systems resist disruption. Sometimes, staying the same is easier than renegotiating every relationship your identity supports. What relationships rely on you staying exactly as you are? The cost of being the person you learn to be is not paid up front. It's deferred. It shows up later, in the quiet sense of underuse, in the feeling of emotional distance from your own life, in the awareness that you are capable of more depth than you allow yourself. It shows up when rest doesn't restore you, when distraction doesn't satisfy, when achievement doesn't land. Because the issue isn't effort, it's alignment. You can pour energy into a life that doesn't fit and still feel empty. You can succeed as the learned self and still feel like a spectator, because success achieved through suppression carries a strange aftertaste. It proves competence, but it doesn't resolve longing. The learned self knows how to function. It doesn't know how to feel fulfilled, because fulfillment was never the goal. Safety was, belonging was, stability was. And now those goals may no longer be enough, but the system that achieved them doesn't know what else to aim for. If safety was the primary objective for so long, what feels dangerous about wanting more now? There is also fear here, a quiet fear, that if you step out of the learned self, you will disappoint people, that you will be seen as selfish, as inconsistent, as difficult, as changed. And changed can feel like rejection because it threatens continuity. So you stay recognizable, even when recognizability comes at the cost of authenticity, because authenticity can disrupt bonds, and the learned self knows how painful that can be. So it keeps you intact, but intact doesn't mean whole, it means unbroken. And sometimes, breaking is what allows something truer to emerge. But breaking also means loss, loss of approval, loss of predictability, loss of identity. And loss is not something the learned self was designed to tolerate easily. It was designed to prevent it. So it resists, not loudly, but persistently, through hesitation, through self-doubt, through rationalization, until the cost of staying becomes visible. And by then, years may have passed. How much time are you willing to spend being the version of yourself that once kept you safe? The learned self does not leave on command. It doesn't dissolve because you understand it. Awareness alone does not dismantle adaptation. It only reveals it. And revelation creates tension because now you can see the trade-off. You can see what the learned self gave you and what it took. You can see the protection and the price. And there is no clean resolution, no simple replacement, no moment where the old identity politely steps aside. There is only the discomfort of living with this knowledge, the knowledge that who you are makes sense and that who you are may no longer be sufficient, that the person you learned to be was necessary, and that staying them indefinitely may cost you something irreplaceable, not dramatically, quietly, over time. So the question lingers, not as a demand, not as a plan, but as an unresolved tension you now have to live with. What is the ongoing cost of continuing to be the person you learned to be? And what would it mean to finally acknowledge it without immediately knowing what comes next?